As an introduction, we like to acknowledge that our mission at Vose Library is to advance learning, inspire curiosity, enrich lives, and promote community. With that in mind, let me introduce our guests. Carisa Corrow spent 14 years as a public school teacher in New Hampshire before becoming a consultant with the Center for Collaborative Education, working with educators to examine their learning and assessment systems. In 2020, she started Educating for Good with a mission to help schools create systems that work for learners and the community with the ultimate vision for a just and equitable world. Carisa is actively involved in Concord Showing Up for Racial Justice, volunteers at the Soup Kitchen, and tutors. She lives with her husband, who is also an educator, and their 3 children on stolen Abenaki land in Pennacook, New Hampshire. Gary Chapin has been working in education since 2000, first as a teacher, 9th grade social studies in Central Maine, then as a curriculum director, then as Department of Ed researcher, and most recently, for nearly 10 years, as a consultant, advocate, and supporter of equity-based practices such as competency-based learning, performance assessment, adaptive leadership, and collaborative cultures. He's deeply fascinated by questions like, what should kids learn? How do we decide what kids should learn? How do we learn what they learned? How can learning what they learned help them learn more? Also, systems. Without further ado, please help me welcome Gary and Carisa. Hello, Gary and Carisa.
Hello.
Hi.
So, oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So this is a book talk, and so this is the plan, I think, and anybody's free. The plan is that we'll talk about how we writing the book and why. And then we'll do some readings from the book, and then we'll invite a conversation about the book, or really anything. We're not going to tell you to stop talking. You want to talk about something else. So how does that sound, Carisa? I'm really curious, as I told this story a couple of times about how the book came about. So I'm curious what Carisa's story is about how this book came about. So I'm gonna let her start.
I was going to make us something really clever, but I'm not going to. So Gary and I collaborate on a lot of things. And so he had this idea of falsehoods to write a blog post. And so he said, I have this idea, falsehoods about, I think, assessment we started with. And we worked together and collaborated on that. We asked our partners to give us some feedback, and we published that. And then he said, I like that. We got a lot of good feedback from that. Let's do another list, another blog post. And after the second one, I was like, this is a good little book. Like, we can do a whole series of these and create a small book that has a lot of information in it. Teachers especially don't have a lot of time. And so we thought we could provoke some thought to keep folks honest about the education system that they are working in and navigating, but also hopefully working against to make it better for all students and teachers themselves. So we worked really hard over a few months to just make the list, and it was fun. And that this is our pandemic project, Gary and I.
Yes. Like, what did you do with your pandemic? It was interesting. I discovered the Falsehoods format from this obscure corner of the programming world, and this idea that there are things that we know are not true, and yet we act as if they are true. And this apparently is a regular phenomenon in the programming world in a number of areas around names and addresses and stuff. So when we wrote the first 2, which were about assessment and grading and reporting, it really felt like a new way to look at it, because one of the things about the pandemic is that all of the things that I thought had been true for 7 years about the inequities in the system and the gaslighty administrations and federal departments of ed, they seem even more true. It's like it was even more apparent that there was crappy practices going on, and that by trying to be provocative and poke the bear a bit, we could do it. And so we did. We tried. There's quite a bit of snark in here, and we did try to be entertaining, and also to just speak the truth in non-jargony ways. And Carisa was really encouraging and influential on the format of the book. She's like, we don't have to write 300 pages. This could just be this thing. It'll be great if it, brevity is the soul of wit. And it was really great having a partner to, especially coming up. I don't think we aimed for 126. I think that's just where we ended. We ended at 122, and then Andy Calkins suggested 3 more, which should have been 125. So I'm not sure where it added up to 126. So then we self-published it, which was an interesting decision because that's completely outside of my realm of experience, and Carisa handled all that in the design, and which was amazing. And then just, I'm not sure why I did, but I recorded the audiobook too, which is available. You can get at it through our website, but we put it up on Bandcamp because that's a platform that I'm familiar with. And I'm not even sure why I felt compelled to do that, except I had one friend say, boy, I wish this was an audiobook. It's like, okay. And then that became a 3-week-long project, which was super fun. And a friend did the mastering for us. But really, that's all. Those are just the details. The real point about the book, and the reason why I think it's actually legitimately important, is because one of the things I'm feeling about this current state of education is that it's not enough just to change like how people do things, the technical aspects, like how do you assess, how do you teach, and here's a chart you can use. And it's like we really need to question basic assumptions and look at the beliefs that the system has. Like it's like I'll know what you believe by what you do, not by what necessarily what you say you'll do. So this is really supposed to be like a very a conversation starting kind of a book. It's supposed to be like when schools tell you we believe all kids are equal, you can say, do you really though? Because this is what we see happening. This is the way the school is behaving. And so like we can see what your beliefs are and what you do. That's what ethics is your beliefs based on is enacted.
I think that's really one good example that's in the book, and Gary's going to read a couple of excerpts in a few minutes, but thinking about this pandemic and social emotional learning, and folks saying that this is really important part of going forward in school is tending to mental health and social emotional learning and how to navigate. And they say we believe that, and I believe they believe that, and yet they have practices that are really harmful to social emotional well-being. For example, grading. What happens when you give a kid an F? Kids own their grades as identities. I'm an F student, I'm a C student, I'm a D student. When you tell kids their worth is on a standardized test that they take on one day in March, that's how smart you are, right? That does not help with social emotional well-being, because people own those particular identities. Or if I'm not good at school, that means that I'm not smart, and that's not true. And so they say social emotional learning is important, and yet they go back to these practices that are in opposition to those things. And that's really one example of a falsehood that we say we believe. And I actually struggled with this falsehood thing in the writing of it. I was like, I remember Gary being like, now you're twisting that around because that's not a falsehood. So that for me in my brain was really difficult for me to write and think about those things. Like, honestly, that was that concept in the book of honestly, like, let's keep people honest. So the first chapter or the first section of every chapter is the falsehood. It was hard for me sometimes to stay in that space of just saying about the falsehood, but that honestly piece, that which ends up being the more snarky piece, I think, in each chapter, is like bringing folks to really just be honest with the system. Right.
So it's essentially 126 really short essays, and it moves pretty breezy. So I'm going to read the last chapter is what we suggest to do about these things, but I'm going to leave that for later, and I'm going to read a few of these. The way they're structured is that they present the falsehood, and then we use the word honestly as like a trigger, or not a trigger. You can use that word, I think. A trigger to say this is what's really going on, and we do that every time. And that it's sort of somebody came up to me at a conference and says, so if you're saying honestly, you're saying everything you said before was not honest. And I was like, yes, it was a falsehood. That was the point. So all right, so here are, I'm going to read 3 of these. So first I'll tell you what the falsehoods are. So let's see, just get the numbers. So this is falsehood number, this is falsehoods we believe about kids, numbers 2 and 3. First falsehood, kids are empty vessels. Second falsehood, kids are unshaped clay. John Dewey was among the first in America to argue against the idea that kids are a tabula rasa, or a clean slate, upon which the educational system can write its ideas and ideals and create an, in quotes, good citizen. Any teacher or parent or kid or person who has ever seen a kid learn something would tell you that the empty vessel model for education is not only wrong, but stupidly wrong. It is a delusion of the scientific management movement of the 1930s. Honestly, we know that learning is constructed in both the experience and the reflection on the experience in iterative cycles. One reason we hang on to the empty vessel myth is because it would be so convenient if it were true. So simple and so efficient. Another reason is because it places us in the position of rightness, authority, and control. All conditions that are far more comforting than they ought to be, considering the evils that they obscure. For example, supremacy, paternalism, diminishment, and institutional bullying. So that's one. The next is falsehoods about grading and reporting. So, oh no, I just threw out my bookmark and now I've lost my place. Okay, first falsehood, a kid who is learning well will get good grades. Falsehood number 2, a kid who is learning badly will get bad grades. Any teacher's experience with kids, and possibly every person's experience in school, argues that it's not as simple as this, and the lie that we tell ourselves is that it is, in fact, as simple as this. When we say to a kid who's getting bad grades, you aren't meeting your potential, how do we know that? And why aren't we reporting on whatever evidence we've used to discern their potential rather than on whatever it is that generated the bad grades? There is a fatal disconnect between grades and learning. The reasons a kid does poorly on an assessment and gets a bad grade are so varied that the poor grade should be the beginning of the assessment, not the summation. The reasons a kid does well are also varied. It's true that a kid who has, in quotes, learned well will have a higher probability of getting a good grade, but the meaning of doing well is obscured by other variables. They test well, they got tutoring, they have a safe place at home to study, etc. And the value of grades as guideposts for future learning are obviated. Honestly, learners might have learned a lot and were unable to demonstrate the learning in the way that the assessment demanded. For example, a kid might have a good understanding of complex economic concepts, but difficulty writing about it. If the teacher accepts only constructed response essays as evidence that students understand cause and effect in economics, then even the kid who has learned a lot will likely get a bad grade. On the other hand, some students might be really good at memorizing definitions and scenarios, but can't transfer that information to new contexts. Poorly designed tasks or tests might capture memorization abilities, but not transfer or strategic thinking. Carisa, you look kind of dreamy in there. Oh, you're looking at somebody. Okay. I thought you were in reverie, listening to your own words.
I am in one of the school districts I'm working in, and so this is the space that I'm presenting from. So folks are leaving me alone in this back corner.
This light off, and that switch is right there. And then when you go out, there's like one light switch right by
Okay.
that counter right there.
Thank
That's
you.
it.
Thank you.
But otherwise, you're locked in, so nobody can bother you.
I'm locked in. All right. So when you were reading that, Gary, I was thinking a lot about the pandemic again, and us capturing what students are learning. A lot of folks are talking about learning loss, and that may be true that folks or kids did not learn what they would have learned in a regular year, but students did learn a lot last year, and we just failed to capture the learning that they did. So they learned a lot about technology that they hadn't been asked to learn before. And we didn't capture that learning and growth in their technology use. They learned a lot about managing time. They learned a lot about asking for help in the school district. One of the school districts I'm working in, a piece of feedback was that I have more confidence in asking my teachers for help than I did before, because I can use the chat on the side in the Zoom meeting that I wasn't asking. So they learned to ask for help in different ways. We just chose not to capture that learning. And so when I hear learning loss, that really hurts me, because I know my own children who we did homeschool and the other two did remote learning. They learned a lot. And even if they didn't learn the things that they would have learned in a regular school year, they just didn't capture. We didn't allow them to capture their learning. And so that's really, harmful, I think, when we say that there was no learning done or learning loss last year.
Right. Your oldest did early college, didn't he?
Yeah, he did all college classes. Yeah.
One of the things that we talk about here is that assessments don't measure what kids know, partly because we don't ask them what they know. What we ask them is, do you know this very narrow list of things that we said you should know? So, hey, I just noticed that Naomi Harvey is on the call, and I've never seen Naomi Harvey before. She's amazing. Well done.
I think it's important too, that our work together over the last few years, 5 years, 6 years, Gary, I think maybe, was influenced too by Rita and Sadaya, who are on the call. They're team members at the Center for Collaborative Education as well. And so their thinking and their questions and their talking all helped influence us in writing the book and thinking through some of the things. So that's important to know. They're in the notes at the end,
Right.
our gratitude. So they're definitely a part of the process.
Right. It's one of the harder things about the pandemic is the not having the wider community of people who seem, for whatever reason, to enjoy talking about things like this.
Another falsehood that is in the book that I'm not going to read from, that I really like and bringing up quite a bit this year in my work in redesigning schools, is curriculum, or everything is curriculum. And so there's this idea that curriculum has to all be written down, or curriculum is the thing you get through. But curriculum is actually, honestly, everything's curriculum. And so when we're thinking about how our school board meetings are running, when we're thinking about how teachers are treating us or treating kids in classrooms, and we're thinking about walking through the hallways, all of that is curriculum. That is all the experience of learning. And so when we think about the written curriculum, that we have to get through the written curriculum, there's so much curriculum out there that we don't really think about when we talk about learning. But everyone is learning all the time, and the experience of school is learning, even if it's written down and if it's not.
Right. And that just points to the need to see teaching as this intensely flexible occupation, and assessment as being the task of capturing learning. Like we make this joke about, we need to capture learning in the wild, not just in the zoo. And so, yeah, I just compared kids to animals and school to a zoo, but it works as an analogy. And then the other thing about curriculum and like official documents is, aside from needing to be more flexible, though, they are like sort of the promise that you make to the kids and to the community about what kids will come out of school with. And I feel like saying that, though, like being like, that makes me want to be more careful about what we promise. Like, what do we really think is important and essential? I'm ready to open this up to questions, unless, should I read another section? What do we think? Okay, Cindy nodded her head. All right, I'll read one more and then we'll have questions. So this is in the assessment section. Falsehood: everything that matters can be measured. Falsehood: everything that can be measured matters. Third falsehood: if it can't be measured, it doesn't matter. The idea that if something is important to us, it can be measured according to a numeric scale and then compared meaningfully to other measurements on that scale is the great conceit of our technocratic age. It's a conceit and a falsehood because every human knows that there are powerful aspects of human experience and capacity that cannot, in fact, be measured according to a numeric scale. These include things like love, friendship, happiness, confidence, perseverance, creativity, etc. Maybe you can measure something connected to those things and use those as proxies for measuring that thing. For example, if you want to measure someone's capacity for friendship, you could decide to count the number of friends that person has. That's troublesome, though, because it doesn't tell you anything about the quality of those friendships. The quality of a friendship matters. How do you measure that? What's your unit of measurement? Do you count the number of times you talk to each other, the number of meals you have together, how often you smile in each other's presence? But none of these things really get at the quality of friendship. This is why we need to move away from measurement to embrace storytelling. Tell the story of the friendship, tell the story of kids learning. Honestly, every once in a while, we think we discover a way to measure a thing, and then suddenly that thing becomes vitally important to our understanding of kids. Aptitude tests fall into this category, as do IQ tests. We think we can measure capacity in the academic subjects, and thus those become the point of schooling. It's almost as if we feel that anything we can measure is our job as educators. If we can't measure something and thus won't be able to sort kids into hierarchies according to that thing, then we decide it's not our job. We talk it up, of course. Creativity and communication and citizenship are important, we say, but those never show up on the Regents or the MCAS or the ACT or the SAT. Those never get reported in articles comparing the performance of districts in a state. So, shall we open it up, Carisa?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you just read reminded me of a conversation we had on one of our podcast episodes. I don't know if Rita was on that one or not, or Soraya. We had it with James, and it was about what is a good school. And I always thought like a good school would be like a postmortem like experience, right? Like 10 years after, what are graduates doing? Are graduates voting? Are graduates participating in community service? Are graduate, like all of those types of things to see what the quality of school is rather than in the moment. So it's like a both and conversation, because you can't understand that until you see the evidence. Where a horseman said that education is the great equalizer, and I think public education is the great socializer, right? And that's really what we're doing. We're creating a society, and we're socializing kids. And what do we want our communities to look like, and what we want our communities to look like in 10 years? We need to think about that now. And a lot of that stuff you can't measure. You just cannot measure, because
Right.
citizenship is not a test. Citizenship is action.
You can describe it. You can describe kids doing it, but measuring it is not necessarily possible. All right. So seriously, we're opening it up for questions now, or comments, or anything,
Or disagreements.
or
We want
disagreement.
especially.
We've been known to be wrong.
I'll speak. This is Philip, former educator from Indiana, and have interacted with Gary over the last couple of years, just about education on Twitter mostly, and found out about the book and picked it up and read it. It had so many great reminders and really little, like, I don't know if the call of turn of phrase is the right word, but just different ways of putting things that I really appreciated. So I really valued the book. What I guess my question is, I read a lot of more like kind of pop psychology, and what is really common in those books is to cite all these research studies. And you guys both of you make some really great claims about education. Can you fill us in on the process of what was it like to decide, do we need to try to provide any evidence for this, or where you left that out and left it more to your personal experience? You just give us a window into what some of those conversations were like, maybe.
I'm trying to think of, like, there was a couple of places where we made statements and I was like, Gary, go find the citation for that. Like, prove this thing
True.
to me before we include it in there. I think a lot of it is really about being epistemologically humble. We use that phrase a lot. So thinking about what we actually can know and can't know. And it's really about logic. And I really push back on like standardized tests, and a lot of folks use standardized tests to be able to put folks in boxes. But I use my dad's story a lot as an example. My dad had a pretty traumatic childhood in second grade. Every day his teacher sent him behind the puppet theater because he was sleeping in class and she didn't want to see him sleeping. And so he didn't learn to read in third grade, special education. And at 15, he dropped out of high school. He learned to read when he was 24. I was 6 years old. But he's one of the smartest people I know. I mean, he has a beautiful math and science mind. When you think about, if you gave my dad a standardized assessment in school, he would have failed that. And so we can know in a standardized test, perhaps, I'll give folks this, if a kid takes a test and they get all of the answers right, or most of the answers right, okay, they're proficient. But if a student doesn't do well on the test, that doesn't mean they don't know the thing. Just means, it might mean they don't know the thing, but it also might mean that that's not the best way that they could demonstrate their learning. And so for me, I don't take stock in that. So it's more about logic rather than psychometrician theory, right? And I think like that's the theory right now, right? That people are talking about getting rid of theories in school. Let's get rid of that theory, not the CRT stuff, right? But let's get rid of psychometric theory, because everyone's so eager to hold on to that standardized testing stuff. And that really does a lot of harm.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. A lot of what we wrote about didn't require evidence because we were pointing out logical fallacies, like, what we say the evidence shows is not what the evidence is, not supported by the evidence. The evidence does not lead to that necessary conclusion that the kid doesn't know how to do this because they didn't do it that one Saturday morning at 10 in the morning. And the other thing is that this was the product of like 7 years of experience, and we started out much more focused. Carisa, tell me please if your experience was different, but when we started out working together, we were doing a lot of work on technical capacity, like how do you do this, and what are some procedures you can do to do better assessment. And the idea was sort of like, well, if we tell people how to do it, we can sneak in the why. We can sneak in why it's important, and we can tell people it would be really great if you did this, but what we came to realize is, like the Maya Angelou quote, we do our best, and when we learn better, we do better. So we came to this point where we felt like it's not just that it would be swell if you did this, but it's necessary for kids. It's good to do this, and to not do this when you know that it's better to do it would be unethical. And so expressing this directly in terms of ethics, like, really freed us to realize that kids are human beings. And that really actually upsets people, the implications of understanding that kids are human beings, and things that are unethical to do to human beings might be unethical also to do to kids, like hitting them, which, a lot of people used to think that, well, a lot of people still think hitting kids is fine, but not hitting another human being. This is why we use the phrase throughout the book, but I really hammered it in my parts, that, how would you feel about being told you have to learn something? Like, kids don't like to learn something when you compel their attendance, just like any other human wouldn't like it. Kids don't like having to ask permission to go to the bathroom, just like any human would hate to have to ask permission to go to the bathroom. So those didn't feel like those were arguments that required evidence. And one of the things that this is the last thing I'll say about it. One of the things we've done over a bunch of years, and Rita's done this, and Soraya done this, and Carisa has done this, is we sometimes start out our learning with teachers. When we're working with teachers, we start with an experience in which they recall a great learning experience they've had in their past, and it may or may not involve school. Usually it doesn't. Sometimes it's something like learning a musical instrument. One woman did couponing, learning how to coupon. An amazing number of people do learning how to drive a stick shift. I think they're traumatized. But the thing is that these are great learning experiences, meaning that the ending, aside from that they learned it, they also had this sense of fulfillment and accomplishment. And almost all of those experiences started with the phrase, I decided I wanted to learn this. I decided I wanted to start couponing. I decided I wanted to play the accordion. And so if your great learning experiences have these shared qualities, how many of those do the learning experiences that we create for our kids have? So we argue through analogy, we argue through logic. We do have, we don't have citations in the book, but we can point you to some if it's ever necessary. I'm not sure how often it is necessary. But that was the thinking there. That was a really long answer to your question, Philip.
I think it worked. And when I was reading it, I was just thinking, who this really is for the teacher or the parent or the administrator who does know this stuff, but then maybe it's gotten a little bit jumbled in their minds. And so I think what you both did a really good job of is kind of laying the groundwork and saying, here are the things that we agree to, and here are the myths and falsehoods that we've allowed to sort of gum up our practice. So thanks for detailing that a little bit.
Thanks. Or you're welcome, I think is the appropriate response.
I feel, so the superintendent that I'm in his building right now, when he read the book, he was like, you know what, I knew all this stuff already. I didn't learn anything new, but we never talk about these things, and we never talk about these things in groups. Like the book did not teach him anything new, except that we rephrased it, or we at least brought things to the surface. But folks just keep moving along. And they know that these things are true, but they act in the other way. And so like, how do we break the cycle? And I'm hoping that's what the book does, is start to break some of these cycles apart, where we don't just keep going through and, accepting standardized tests. I know Gary's going to read a little bit from the last chapter, but I'm thinking about policy and this pandemic, which is really problematic, how folks are responding in schools. In New Hampshire, we just got our test scores back from last year, and folks are still putting a lot of stock in those test scores, even in a pandemic, even when they know themselves that those test scores did not say anything about their own intelligence or their own skills. As students themselves, they know that they don't really mean anything, but they're still like, well, I guess our schools are failing kids because those standardized tests, instead of, in our schools, a lot of ways are failing kids, right? But that's not the measure of how we're failing kids. That's the system also failing kids by using it as a way to withhold funds or prove that a system isn't working. So we all know it, and yet we still allow folks to act, especially our lawmakers. We still allow them to hold us to these really inhumane standards or expectations. And I want to bring up this one funny story. It's not funny, it's sad. I remember Soraya coming and talking about the SAT and her working with kids in Los Angeles. And she said, like, one question, I think maybe you said this in an interview, Soraya, but one of the questions asked these kids in like Southern California about a Zamboni. Like that was like in the question. And just even thinking about like, that's on a standardized test. Or the MCAS. Just 2 years ago, they asked students to take on the role, Black students to take on the role of slave owner and respond. Like that is not cool stuff. And kids are not allowed to talk about those tests. They're not allowed. That one brave student got and said, hey, this is not cool. That one brave teacher said, this is not okay. And like rose it to a level that was examined. But we're not supposed to talk about what's on the standardized test. We're not supposed to talk about those things. And there's a real problem with that, because everything should be open and honest, right? We should be able to have bigger conversations, and we shouldn't be asking kids who have no idea about a Zamboni.
San Diego has a hockey team. Just yeah, the system really incentivizes efficiency, and that's why it's like you talking about the brave student and the brave teacher. It's like one of the things we frequently say, and I believe this to be true completely, is that great teaching is really a form of civil disobedience, and that really helps. That's really helped a lot of people sort of frame the work they're doing, like what they're trying to do in classrooms. Right? So I'm going to ask anybody else if you have questions. I don't have to read anymore, and I would really rather have a conversation.
There's so much in my head right now, but that you all are bringing up for me. And one thing that I'm kind of just ruminating on is how the falsehoods are accepted as truth. And so reading this book, like, what does it mean when I read the actual truth that I already knew, but yet I wrote down that it feels like a cruel form of gaslighting when I was teaching. There were things that I knew weren't right, but I still did it because I was young, because of authority. I wasn't scared of authority, but it felt like if they're doing it, then it must be the right thing to do, to ask students to walk down the hall, like, like in a straight line for no really good reason at that point. But I'm just thinking also about standardized testing and how it does become a part of my identity. And as much as I want to shake it off and unlearn it, it like comes back to me sometimes, right? When I see a grade or a score on my Apple, I don't have an Apple Watch, but like when I go to the gym and they give me a data report, if they had a grade, I would probably feel like a traumatized, right? In some ways, it's like it comes back to it. So anyway, I think one of the things that I'm still struggling with now that I'm working with districts is it requires bravery to come back home, to come back to these beliefs that we know are good for humans, for young people as well. How do you all guide leaders when they know what is best, like when they're reading this book and say, yeah, I know that that's true, but we still need to do X, Y, Z. Like we are in a pandemic, but there's still an audit that I need to ask my teachers to do all these things while they're just trying to do Zoom classes and in-person classes. Like, so how do you do both? That you have, like, you're kind of gaslit in a way, like you have to do both. And so how do you all kind of confront those conversations with leaders that feel maybe conflicted?
I mean, that is the system. You're working in the system, right? You believe in public schools and making them better. So you have to do both things, navigate the system and push against it at the same time, which is really difficult to do. But I think that acknowledging that you are walking both those things and being honest about what happens. I mean, I'm working in a district right now that everyone knows the standardized tests don't mean anything, and yet they still have to go to city council, right? Who's going to talk about the standardized tests. So their job is to acknowledge that that's how it works, but also educate members of the community on the value of what those tests can and cannot tell you. And so some of it is educating those leaders on how to educate their community, right? So giving them examples, talking them through things. I just had a superintendent at a city council meeting get berated for the test scores. And he said, well, we just watched a presentation by some of our students who did an act from a play before this presentation about standardized tests. What did you like? What's more important to you? Like those skills that they demonstrated by doing that play or the standardized tests. And of course the city council said, well, the play, right? Like that's the stuff that's really important. So just allowing folks to find ways to communicate to their communities, the folks that are really holding tight to these tests. We are up against a big system too, right? The educational industrial complex is really strong. And so, I mean, I think about Joe Biden, who said, you're right about standardized tests. And what is he said that in the campaign, and then circle right back together. Yep, everyone's going to take them. Those are so important. So even he acknowledges it. And yet the system that he's leading is pushing us for these standardized tests because they can't imagine a different way to do school. And so it's going to take leaders moral courage. And that's a word I always bring up. Like it has to be perseverance and moral courage. You have to. It is
courageous, yeah.
Yeah, you have to have some civil disobedience. Sometimes you might have to put your job on a line or take a stand. But when you're doing good things for human beings, generally, you're going to be okay, I think.
And there is this level below that too, where like, so at the Lago, which Soraya, they love, for example, the 1 point rubric, which is a specific kind of rubric. But they were like, but we have to give grades. How do we use the 1 point rubric and then give grades? And so I walked them through a process where it's like, okay, you're already doing A, B, not yet. So you already don't have to worry about C's, D's, and F's. So why don't you just say, I mean, you can, it's not something I love, but you can just say the B is the meets and the A is the exceeds. Or you can say a B is a 90. I mean, and they're like, but that's just arbitrary. And I'm like, well, what do you think the whole system is? I mean, the whole grading system is arbitrary. So just use that power. I mean, you make these decisions. When I was a first year teacher, I wrote my own, we didn't have a grading software, so an Excel sheet and I just made up all the weights. And the principal was like, how industrious of you. It's like, holy, that was so unethical. Oh my God. And but you know, like if they're gonna be arbitrary anyway, then be arbitrary in a way that helps. But you're right, Soraya, that is the question I get asked in JCPS, in Kentucky, and in Escondido. Like, how do we do this stuff, which we believe in, when we're in this system that disincentivizes doing this stuff? And that's why I talk about it as a form of civil disobedience. And then while they're doing that, you get, like, I'm here with the union, and there are a bunch of people here from JCPS. I'm in Los Angeles at an NEA conference, and there are a bunch of people here from Louisville, from JCPS, and their union is trying to change the practices. So you start off, you're like, you try to change it at every level. It's the problem. It's what keeps me up at night staring at the ceiling, which Sunshine could attest to.
There's other things keeping it in place. I remember doing work in Vermont and having a very particular conversation about grades because they're proficiency based, and their state law actually allows them to not have grades. They don't have to if they don't want to. They have a different way they have the possibility of not issuing grades like that. And school districts were like, well, we have to. And I was like, why do you really have to? Well, because you have to have a GPA to go to college. Well, we've had homeschool students. So it's like, we've had homeschool students forever that haven't had GPAs that go to college just fine, right? So that was, one ticket off. And then we go down the list of things, and I got to all of them. And then he said, well, what about scholarships? So, okay, you get to go to college without a GPA, but scholarships often require GPA, or scholarships require that you participate in the National Honor Society, which requires a GPA. So there's a lot of other parts of the system that are holding things in place. So even if you wanted to be civilly disobedient, you are going to hurt some kids in some ways, because that's how kids in poverty navigate going to school. And so it's just so big and complicated and messed up to think about, like, where are we going to push and where are we going to navigate. And it's so easy for me my kids don't take standardized tests. Like, that's a rule that we've had forever. My oldest son, he's 18. If he wants to take an SAT now, he can. He's not going to, but he could if he wanted. But in my house, we just don't do that. And that does limit their possibilities for some things. But we're able to rationalize that and say we're just not participating in the system. But there are some complications to that. A lot of kids have gotten full scholarships for their SAT scores, and that's their way out of poverty. That's their way out of the system. So it is complicated for sure.
But that could be like one of the places where civil disobedience comes in, because I've known guidance counselors who are like, well, we have a standards-based system, but if a college needs a GPA, then we give the kid a GPA. It's like they can make it work. And but the point is, I've never met a college admissions person. We did a study in 2008 with Great Schools Partnership of 47 schools in New England, 47 colleges in New England, and none of them were as wrapped up in GPAs or class rank as all of the high schools that we're worrying about this are. They're like, whatever, we'll make it work, just as long as like every school, when they submit grades, there has to be a page explaining like what the grades mean and how their system works. As long as that's clear, then we're fine. We can make it work. We get kids from Thailand submitting here. They don't have their GPAs are different. And so
Cindy has a question. Yay, question.
Oh my gosh, the handheld. I'm sorry, I'm not responding to the icons.
I just only put that up a second ago. Anyway, thank you. This has been super interesting. And my question is based on my experience with the Zillow effect. There's a lot of great philosophy, and in my heart, I know that many of the things you're saying are right, but I think it's harder now than ever. When I was first teaching, we didn't have the No Child Left Behind. That didn't exist yet. But in the beginning, I thought, oh, this will be good. Kids in Arlington will know the same as Abington. I was in Virginia. So that mutated and became, the Pearson mass mega industry, just like pharmaceuticals and everything else. But there's also the Zillow effect. And that's how the principal actually either coined the term or talked to the PTA or whatever. But the scores are how the district is measured in a quick snapshot bite for the public. So I haven't read your book yet, but I'm going to go to the library and check it out. And what do you suggest if that's skipping ahead to the last chapter?
No.
So what do we do? I mean, I get civil disobedience, but I've lost my power because I'm not in the classroom anymore.
So one of the things is that we have to shift our communities. So we have to shift our communities and have different conversations about the purpose of public education in our communities. And schools are not really good at sharing other types of stories, especially, some schools are. Jefferson County is really good. They have their own news station where they're sharing their stories. But they're the 27th largest school district. But New Hampshire, we've got all these small school districts. They have no other way to share their story with their communities. So that's one thing that's important. So to bring community into your school and to showcase the good work that students are doing, which will then compound pride in school, and it will be able to show the community that, hey, there's good things happening, we want to reinvest. Another thing to consider, and school districts, especially New England, do this because of NEASC, but to create a portrait of the graduate. A lot of folks will do that as sort of, a committee in the school creates what their vision is, but to really do it well is to get out into the community and have conversations with folks about what their hopes for graduates are and what their students should know and be able to do. So in Franklin, New Hampshire, a small city, we have about 8,000 residents here. We went out and canvassed in an election year in a pretty red city. Well, it's like a reddish purple. It's like a reddish purple city. And so we went out and asked those two questions, and folks were like, this is another political canvassing, but we went to the transfer station and we went to the polling places on election day, city election day. We went to farmers markets and we asked these questions of citizens, and we said, what are your hopes for graduates? And what should students be able to know and do? And those two questions across all the data we collected, folks have very similar answers regardless of the political hats or bumper stickers or t-shirts they wore. And so that's really where it has to start, is the community conversations locally. And then folks will want to invest in the public schools. Franklin is a particular city that has been starved in so many ways in terms of their school system. And yet they have a community that's really supportive and interested in supporting the schools in terms of mentorships and offering internships and those kinds of things. And so it really has to be about conversation, and it's going to take a lot because we've been socialized that school has to be like this for the last 100 years. We have to have classes, 7 classes a day, or 45-minute chunks of time of learning. Those are all made up stuff, but we've all been socialized to think that's how school has to be. And so just having conversations with folks about the possibilities. Last month, I did a workshop with teachers where I said, there's no such thing as math class and English class and social studies class anymore. Instead, we have a class called Pesticides, and Me. And we have a class called the Star Spangled Banner. And we have a class called Zombies. And we have a class called Harry Potter. And they got these classes and they were sitting with different subjects, area experts, and they had to create a class where students would demonstrate math and English and social studies skills. And so just allowing folks to play in what school could be, what public school could look like, is super helpful. And we had community members come in and participate with that. So the mayor was there that day, and we had city council members. So I think that the to do is to have conversations and just push back on a lot of these things. It's going to take a long time, if ever we ever get to a place. But in New Hampshire, and this is in the other parts of the country, I'm sure this is happening similarly. Our public education system is not faring well. We have a pretty aggressive legislature. And we've got teachers leaving, and we have privatization and vouchers, and more vouchers coming. And so if we want to save public schools, we have to start talking to our communities in more open ways about what our hopes are for our students, but also what our hopes are for our communities later on. Because our hopes are not that kids get a particular standardized test score. No one said, I want kids to have a 1,500 on their
Right.
SATs. They said they wanted kids to be with the collaborators and have basic math skills and give back to their community and be happy and do jobs that they want to do. Those are the things people said were important, but we have to have those conversations.
It's like the curriculum director's job and the superintendent's is really this rhetorical storytelling job. And if you and state tests tell a story, it's just a very narrow, stupid, and shallow story. So you should be telling a different story. And I mean you generally, not you, Cindy. So I mean, like Carisa's activity was like setting up another story, and then it's like the other side of having a really good portrait of the graduate is that you then have exhibitions. Like I worked at a district that started doing senior capstones in like 2006, and they were open to the public, so the public would come in and see the kids doing this great stuff. And then I was curriculum director at another district in Maine where they had exhibitions starting in the 5th grade all the way up through 11th grade, and the public was invited in for those. So that would be the story of what's going on in the school. And JCPS right now in Kentucky, they have this backpack project, which is still being, I mean, it's been implemented, but it's still new, where kids gather up their own evidence to decide what story they want to tell about their learning. So I think that leading a school becomes like a form of almost preaching. You're telling a moral, ethical story, and you should, like, people think you shouldn't be talking about right and wrong when you talk about curriculum, but how can you not talk about right and wrong explicitly? It seems like by agreeing not to talk about right and wrong. Well, I came so close to saying that, Cindy. I came so close to actually saying that. By agreeing not to talk about right and wrong, we basically were giving up that fight. So we're at 5:01, and
Well, 8:01 in our Eastern Standard
sorry.
Time, Gary. We're not all in California.
The weather's very nice here.
Yeah. Listen, I wanted to just share with you guys that even a librarian can make a little dent. Someone called the library today and asked if they could drop off their encyclopedias, which we had a little chat about that. And she said, well, I know, everybody Googles everything now, and that's how we learn everything. And I said, well, you can find some good things on Google. And she said, well, these kids, they're not learning anymore in school. They're not learning math, and they're not learning. And I said, well, you know what I hope? I just hope they're all learning to be good people. And, you have to start somewhere with that kind of conversation. So I put my pitch in as a former principal and educator and now librarian. So I'll just shift it that way. But I want to thank both of you. I want to thank both of you for joining us. And we have the book at Vose Library, and I'm super excited to dig into that. And this conversation lit a fire under me once again, that passion. And I hope it has our crowd here tonight too. So let me just close by saying thank you to everybody for joining us. And we hope that you'll spread the word and join us for next Wednesday's presentation, where Tim and Lori Warden, some locals from Appleton, Maine here, share their adventure through their magical Nordic island country of Iceland trip. So thank you, everybody. Take care. Good night. Stay well.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.